All right, let's learn how to manage multiple objects at the same time. A process that's going to unlock a huge amount of potential in our future coding work because we're not just limited to one thing. We can now use, well, soon at least, be able to read and write as many things as we want to from these files so easily. It's going to be wonderful and unlock so much potential. Amazing. Here we go. The first thing you'll notice is that I've made a couple adjustments to our code from last tutorial. This is just good coding practice. I've done a refactor, which means I've shifted around the logic a little bit. I haven't really changed it fundamentally, but I've reorganized how it's written to be a little bit more comprehensive and succinct in a way. So if you need to, pause the video and try to update your code to mimic mine if you're following along that intently. But you'll see that I've taken these big blocks of code of reading and writing from the main section, and I have shifted them into their own methods. So I have the writing method here that takes in a student and a file name, and then it's able to have a custom file name, have the file be written to a custom file, and then the student itself will be written to JSON and report that it's succeeded if it's done so. Awesome, a useful tool. So remember to pause and get that figured out in your own code if you need to. I've also updated reading from a file, so I can put in a custom file name, and I'm going to start with an empty student and try to read from, oh, I should actually change this from output to file name. Here we go. I had a little typo myself. And then I'm going to try to read the student from that custom file using the reader. And if I've done so, print out the string and return that student to potentially work with it later on in our program. Wonderful. So remember, pause the video if you need to update your own code. And I'm going to assume that if you've pressed play, that you now have your own code updated. So we have as a recap, a student object that can have all this content with it, including a toString printout to kind of prove to ourselves the content we pull from files is actually moving into our program, which is great. And we have a basic JSON object. Notice I've also moved this out of the main. I just made it kind of existing outside of it in the field variable so that it's accessible by our other content down below. So make a note of that as well. And I'm actually going to simplify this object we're instantiating. I'm just going to keep it as a basic student object, just with the 3 basic parameters that it needs, just for the sake of kind of not overcomplicating our lives as we learn about multiple object entries. Great. So in the past, we've just taken a single student, and what I could do right now is I could take this functionality, write the student to file, and pass my student in, as well as a file name. Let's call this a test.json file. And what I could do right now, press run, successfully written. Let's head in here. I have test.json, and we'll see, bam, I have this JSON data output to the file. Beautiful, what I was hoping to see. But I promised you something more. So I'm going to move this down here. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a couple more students. Let's go student 2, and I'm going to make a new student. Let's call this, like we did before, Yolanda. Let's call the age 40, and let's say political science. Cool, now we have a separate entry here. Let's make a third one. 3, let's go a new student, Jeff, age, let's go 36, and let's go speech language pathology. I may have family members with these names and IDs, so don't tell them I'm releasing their identities online. Anyway, we now have multiple students that we could write to a file. So what if I did this? What if I took student 1 and I wrote it to a file? And then what if I did this? 2 more times, but I did student 2 and I did student 3, all to the test file. Well, let's give this a try and see what happens. We wrote all into the file. Awesome. And now we head over to the file, and oh, only Jeff is showing up. Huh. Right. Last tutorial, Mr. Owl told us that when we write to a file, it overwrites all of the contents. So each time that we run one of these, it overwrites the previous one. So Yolanda overrode Scott, and then Jeff overrode Yolanda. This is not what we wanted, so we can't actually use this strategy. So we need a new one. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to back this up a little bit, just to one write call, and I'm going to do this. Oops. Do it correctly. I'm going to make a student array called students, and I'm going to populate it with my 3 students. I now have one thing that I can write to the file. Rather than three separate things, it's one thing that includes the three things in it, an array. And now I'm going to try to send this array into my write to file. Notice here, though, that I have a student being accepted rather than a student array. Actually, let's just see what happens if I run this here. See what our program says and does. If I reload this, it allowed me to run the program, but it took the first student in the list and just wrote that one and not the other ones. Oh, it's because I referenced this previous variable. It's not because I wrote this list at all. So it's not pulling this thing. If I want to pull this thing and try to send it in, it won't even let me because it's the wrong data type. This is an array. This is a variable. So I need to actually update my method. Now, I could make two separate methods, one that allows just a student and one that allows an array. You can do that if you like for some options, for some overloading options. But for now, I'm just going to keep it straightforward on the screen here. So now it should actually be accepting the students properly. I could rename this in here. Let's just call this students for the plurality being consistent. And let's see what happens now that we've allowed the right data type to be passed in. Whoa, here we go. Now we're cooking, as the youth say these days. So we now have three individual objects stored in our JSON. Let's make sure that we thoroughly understand what it is that we're seeing here. Each of these entries is one object. There's the first student 1, student 2, student 3. They're separated by commas. But on the outside, all of them are surrounded by these squared brackets. That's because we're storing an array of entries. And arrays are something that we can work with. So here's one of the examples of how we can use the array formatting to contain multiple entries of information. So here's an example of where that context pops up. It actually might be really useful in some of the programs that you're creating. Great. So now we have this array of objects in test.json. Wonderful. So we've written it. So I'm just going to kind of back up a sec here and comment these things out. And we're going to see if we can't actually comment all of these out for now. Pull some content back in. I'm just going to collapse the write to student file logic right now. And we're going to take a look at the read student from file. So my read student from file, all I technically need to do is just write test.json as the file name to be able to pull content from a file. I have test.json. Remember that previously we had the ability to read this kind of output 2. Let's just practice this for a sec, the old one. Output2.json. If I run this, I will see it pulling in these GPAs, Lucy with physics, there's the GPAs, there's Lucy with physics. Perfect. So it's still successfully pulling in proof that this is still working. But what if we tried to pull in this test.json file that has the multiple entries? What happens now? We have a problem. We have expected object, but was begin array. So we're having some confusion of what we're getting. We're getting an array instead of an object, and so we now have some confusion on what type of data that we're pulling from, which makes sense because we now know the way that we've stored the data is now in a different format. So the way that we read the data needs to change. So let's try to do some experimentation to see what's going to change here. Remember that we kind of just converted the data type to arrays? Well, inside of here, rather than just pulling a single student, what if we pulled a whole array of students? Well, now we have an issue here where we're expecting an array, but we're only getting a single student idea. So let's update here as well. Let's say I want the concept of an array to be what's converted into rather than a single student. So hey reader, I want the JSON array of students, not just a single student. All right, my program seems to have stopped complaining, and I still have the report of a successful printout, and I'm running the toString method on this stuff. I'm trying to read from this test file. Okay, let's see what happens here. And it looks like I have an error somewhere. Let's just see where it pops out. And where's my error showing up? Oh, here. Return student. Right. One more thing we didn't update. This is where using the debug log is really useful. I updated the type here and the type here, but I totally blanked on updating the type for the return type. No problem. just fix that problem, run it again, and now I get successfully read, but I get this memory address because my printout in here is I am just printing out the stringified memory address of this array. Okay, so that's not the most helpful thing for us to be able to see the output. In fact, we're going to have to do a little bit more work to see the output here. So notice I'm returning this array, which means this is actually a student array of students that I retrieve, which means I can actually loop over. It's an array, so I'm going to loop over. I'm going to use the enhance for loop like this. Student, type it properly, from my students list. And each of these students, I'm going to print out. If you don't know that shortcut, just so you know, for a little tip, if you type SOUT and press tab, it does the printout automatically like this. I'm just going to print out the student that I retrieve from this list. So I'm accessing each internal entry from the students list. And let's see what happens. I have Scott, I have Yolanda, I have Jeff. Nice. It looks like we've done it. Notice this is all commented out. I'm not pulling this data from inside the program. This reading from file is getting this array of objects from the JSON file, storing them as individual entries in the array of students, and then I can loop over and print them out individually. Just for further proof, what if I change this to Carolyn, and then I change the age 30, and then I change the major to none? Maybe they haven't finished school yet. Okay, some clear shift in our information. Carolyn, none. I've read the data in. So now I have the ability to store and read multiple objects. Even cooler, check this out. I can take the structure of a new entry, mimic it, and maybe I say not applicable. The age is, let's say, -1 for like kind of like a non-entry, and not applicable, just kind of like a placeholder for like a failed entry here. Bam. That fourth entry that I just added in the text file can be pulled into my program. And not only is it the text output working, I'm also confident that it's stored as an object, meaning I can now interact with these objects in my program as normally functioning objects, even though their source was just text. So this conversion, this back and forth between persistent text storage and actual complex objects in our programs are now enabled with multiple objects being stored, multiple different files that we can customize, being able to be swapped between dynamically, one or many things being able to be focused on if we choose to, and many different data types of information. Remember, you could even go back. I took my student class and I removed a little bit of the course scores and best friend content from this tutorial just to make it a little bit easier to follow. But you could re-enable that and see how this all works with those things being added back in for multiple entries. In fact, I'd like you to. And even more than that, I'd like to see you with whatever custom class that you've been working with to practice. I'd like you to try to instantiate many instances of that class, write those instances to a JSON file, and read them back in using the same type of process that I've used here. And once you practice that enough, you can refer to my next video, which is the final one of this segment of learning, where I give you a challenge for a program I'd like you to create. I'll show you one in advance so that you kind of get a framework of what to do, but you're going to try to take what we've learned about JSON and make a game based off of persistent JSON files as their backend database. More in the next video, though. This one's gone long enough. See ya.